welcome to Tea Time with Jesse. I'm here in Beijing with my good friend Michael Cherney, longtime American in Beijing, internationally displayed photographer, and left fielder for the Pinyin Minion softball team, which was a big part of my life here in Beijing. Thanks so much for having me over to your beautiful home to look at your photography and drink tea and look outside of Beijing.
It's my pleasure. This is what it's all about.
That's great. It's really great to be able to talk to you about your photography because in the scene of Americans living in Beijing, I got a chance to see your photography around at different people's houses or even on display in at the Huntington Garden. In California. But I've never had a chance to actually sit down and talk with you about your photography. And we're going to do something a little bit different than normal. Normally we'd start drinking the tea now. But because your studio is 20 meters that way, I think let's first go to your studio, take a look. And then if you're watching on the video version of this, you'll get a chance to look at the actual pieces. And if you're listening to the audio, I suppose we'll skip to the audio part of the interview. Does that sound good?
Let's do it.
All right, let's go. All right, and we're back. Thank you so much for the tour of your studio and looking at your pieces. Really, I love the scrolls in the books and all these different very long displays. It really is just in the days where you can take an iPhone, you do a panorama, and I think people almost get bored of it. It comes out very cookie cutter panorama. Those were not cookie cutter panoramas.
When you think about thinking about a traditional format from hundreds of years ago in the days before, that was like the movie before movies.
Yeah, you don't want it to end. Right. Let's keep seeing more of the scenery.
You picture people with their big old traditional clothes with the big sleeves, what did you bring?
Yeah, I brought a movie, that's true. So let's make some tea and talk a little bit more about your journey in art and photography.
Sure.
This is one of our new green teas. So only a couple weeks from being picked now.
All right.
Over here, this is ancient tree green tea, which is a very rare thing. So usually they use the ancient tree leaves to make pu'er and more recently white tea and red tea. But green tea, you open the bag and you want to drink it within a year. So the ancient tree people don't usually make it because they can get a good price for the other stuff that will age and get better.
Yeah.
So I'm very excited that I got some ancient tree green tea this year.
All right.
And of course the green tea every year, Qingming Festival. They pick the leaves, and
is there a set time period where a tree technically becomes ancient?
So usually it's 200 years is what they say is an ancient tea tree. It's a little bit of I don't think the law enforces that. Also, it's difficult to tell how old the tree is unless you cut it down, and people don't want to do that. So.
Yeah.
But generally, those trees are almost all wild. There are some imperial tea farms that were planted 800 years ago. Not many. So when you get to ancient tea trees, these are wild trees that grow in the natural area where the tea plant grows. And then the locals have known forever where those trees are, and they literally know every one of them. They're so valuable that in that part of the world they are known to the tree. And every year people will go up and pick from those trees, and they actually don't get a lot of tea from those because the young trees are qingchun, it's springtime, they're blooming, and the old trees are they're not putting out many leaves anymore. They're just happy to be
taking their
around.
time.
Yeah, exactly. So be able to have some of this great green tea. So let's give everybody a really brief introduction. So who are you, and how did you come to be a photographer in China, and what kind of photos do you make?
So I first came to China in 1991. I had studied some Chinese at university in New York, in Binghamton. And it was one of the schools, this is 87 to 91, so weren't that many Chinese language programs. But thankfully they had it there. And because my father had done some work with Asia, some business, I figured I'd try the language. I would have been a very unsuccessful business person, I think, but I just got the bug for the language and the culture. But my grandfather, I grew up around beautiful photos because my grandfather was a photographer with the New York Daily News. He died when I was very young, but he took that iconic...
Smell the it's good stuff.
He took that iconic, the Hindenburg explosion, like a Led Zeppelin 1, that was the...
He took that photo?
That photo
as
an assistant photographer with the New York Daily News back then. young photographer, I should say. And but all, and that time, before TV, news, crime, sports, all this, because people would listen on the radio and then they got to see the one picture the next day.
So those photos had like a big outsized impact on what people thought about the world. Cheers. Enjoy the green tea. Oh, really nice. They're good?
Yeah.
Yeah, the ancientry is a little bit almost like a thunk in the aftertaste.
Yeah.
But it's still, this is why it's so interesting. It's still really nice and sweet and light and greeny, like a green tea.
Yeah.
But then there's like that little extra funk.
Yeah.
So you kind of had photos in the head.
And then when a lot of, not that many foreign students in the early 90s, was people that either were going to work at, people weren't really thinking about doing business at that time. It was more going to work at an embassy or study Chinese medicine or really love Chinese culture.
These are the type of people in Beijing
right.
who do you find
And
there.
so when and then actually a couple years into being here as a student, I got sick, and it turns out I had testicular cancer. And like the day I was supposed to start an internship at the commercial section of the U.S. Embassy was when I went to the hospital. I was in pain, and I think that was heaven just kind of being like,
they're like, get out of the commercial section of the U.S. Embassy. Like, this is not your path.
And so, and it kind of like, I started looking back, before that I wasn't really into photography very much, but I thought of it as a way to kind of, I had very intensive treatment and then I was cured. And so I was like, this is all extra time. I want to really show that I'm observing what's around me and really appreciating. And so I figured I would try that with photography and photographing what I know, and that was China. And so I didn't have formal schooling in fine art or photography, but I was just very lucky in that I was kind of coming at it from a very pure place, and I very quickly got very positive feedback.
Oh, that's great. And so for people that may not know, so you've been displayed in many places around the world. You were in the Met, is that correct?
The first time I ever exhibited anything was in the Met, which is
really?
totally opposite.
That's not usually how it goes for fine art. I don't know a lot about fine art, but like, so you had a chance to be displayed in all these places, and also within China, you were saying you displayed all over the country. Do you, like, what does it mean for you to have that sort of work displayed internationally? Because it's you coming from America to China, Chinese themes in the photographs, and for people who didn't see the video section, would describe the type of photographs you take.
Yeah, well, the subject matter is very connected to Chinese visual art and art history. That was the inspiration behind it. So at the time, at the beginning, I wasn't really thinking about, people will love this, or this will be successful fine art. It was really just a way of exploring, and that I think for people that haven't traveled much in China, it's important to realize that it feels, wherever you go, you're part of this story, this historical story. Like you think about going in the U.S., maybe the Grand Canyon or something, where millions of people go, but you still want it to feel as if it's undisturbed nature. But in China, most places there'll be a stone staircase surrounded by calligraphy by people of note. And so you don't have to be an artist, but you're kind of part of that story when you're there. And so this was, places have accumulated a certain amount of cultural memory. And so with art, you can make these really great connections over a very wide span of time. And it also is very humbling, because you think one artist, one lifetime is just one. If you can place one road on one stone in a very long road, that's already very challenging.
You see the accumulation, though, because it's like, so the pieces are these long scrolls or folded books, but generally these very long panoramic type photographs, usually of nature.
Right, and when people appear, they'll be very small.
Yeah.
It's almost like a
Or your
metaphor.
car. I remember you had shown the car that you had driven to these really remote areas was in the corner of the thing, and it looks like a bug or something like that. So it's like the nature sort of overwhelmingly controlling the visual space. And then a lot of them are also very grainy,
Yeah.
which has this effect when it's also printed on the traditional Chinese paper of creating almost like an ink painting feel.
Right.
Do you always do black and white? Is that always a thing as well? Because most of the ones that I saw were in black and white.
Most of the works are black and white, and I think the general rule, which I kind of learned and followed from the beginning, was that if the color information is important, then include the color. Otherwise, just black and white, where you can focus on the content, and so focus on the forms, and it also makes it a little bit more consistent if you have a series of images.
And so it's kind of interesting for people that think of like classical Chinese paintings, mountains, clouds, the sort of the creation of the space around the negative space. This is what I wanted to ask you. I'd heard once, and I don't know whether this is real pop knowledge or not, but they said in the Western art, we tend to create around the positive space. Put the person and their face first, and then the background is background. Right. Whereas in the Chinese traditional composition style, you first build out the negative space, and then it's almost like you want to have as little in there as possible. Right. Is that an accurate way of looking at the thing or not?
For sure. There was a revolution in Chinese painting between like the Song dynasties around 1,000 years ago and the Yuan dynasty a few hundred years later. It's like I've heard the terms used as either like reductionism or minimalism, or where it's essentially conveying the same information but with less and less strokes. And what happens, and especially you think about if you've seen people paint ink paintings or calligraphy, there's no covering anything up like there is on oil paintings. You can go over stuff. Yeah. It's just whatever you want to be white, you just have to leave it white. Yeah. And so you have to think ahead. This is going to be a cloud. I got to paint around it or something like that. And there's no mistakes allowed. And so it becomes this very spontaneous, almost like performing jazz or something. And see how the ink behaves.
Well, it's one of the things I always found fascinating about the difference between the Chinese and the Western art was in China you have this educational system where it's like study, take the test, and it's very the opposite of improv. But the art is, I don't know if it's almost rebelling against that, but the art is like, I'm going to see if I can find a way to draw 5 strokes and outline an entire scene, and then almost dare people to tell me that was not beautiful.
Right. Exactly.
I don't know whether that makes sense.
No, it does. And it's supposed to be, it's almost like I guess it would be the same with jazz music too. If it's too contrived, it doesn't feel natural. That you have to be so comfortable that when the time comes that you're actually performing something, you're not thinking about it that much.
And this is a calligraphy as well. It's like as somebody who, I took a calligraphy class during study abroad. The more you think about it, the worse it gets. Right. It's funny, like if you tell somebody, write me a note, they'll write it for you. If you say, write it, but make it look really good, you go, now you lose control over it. And so there is that, I'm guessing from the way you talk about it, you enjoy that sort of like, improvisational element to taking the photos and finding the spaces.
I mean, there's not as much of that once I'm editing. I mean, I look through the photos that I've taken to find little pieces and often get surprised by elements I couldn't predict, tiny little pieces. Yeah. But more of that improv stuff is in the moment. You just kind of do enough research about a particular location or a subject, and you put yourself in the environment and then just be open to what nature presents.
So let's take maybe like I'm sure that we could talk hours on just the subject, but let's go really quickly through like what goes from 0 to 1 of like you have a concept for what you want to shoot, how you do the resource, how you'd shoot it, how you'd print it. What goes into making one of these gigantic hand scroll, 15-meter long photographs?
It means looking at a lot of old paintings. Some of the paintings can have a certain element to the geography, which you can find in nature. It may not even be the place that the painter was trying to predict. It may have a different geography, looks like that. Or it can be a subject, a particular location, or it has this certain historical element. I think the best works are the ones where you get a beautiful geography and some interesting history happening at the same place. And so, but then having looked at that painting or that subject, I do research at home on Google Earth and kind of get the lay of the land of like I was when I talk about this Changjiang series that I did, the Yangtze River. Here's a mountain. If I'm standing at this spot, maybe I could get a good overview of this place I'd like to photograph, and that at least allows me in the moment when I'm there to get close enough that, oh, maybe this spot that I planned, it's obscured by trees, but if I go up here a little bit, or if I borrow a ladder, or if I climb a electric pole, or ask a farmer, maybe they know. And so the tools now where you can find your way with satellite imaging, I mean, and you think about it, it doesn't matter if you were Chinese or Western, years ago, unless you grew up as a local, it would have been so hard to find these places. But then, so take the pictures, and because it's film, I have to feel confident that I've got something, although you never really know until you develop the film. So then get home, develop the film, and then sometimes I develop the film, sometimes I ask others to develop it that could do it much nicer than I can. And then scan then I have a little light table looking through with a little magnifier. And sometimes, even though it's that little piece of nature, it's still hard to isolate certain elements. So I take little black pieces of paper and cover up parts of the film frame, and all of a sudden this either piece or this line will appear that looks really perfect. So then I scan that and enlarge it. But I don't change the content, but just enlarge it and figure out, okay, if it's this high, it'll be an album that's this long, and then paper is of a certain length. So if it can fit on one sheet, great. If not, I print out sections, and then I give those pages to a mounter. And there are different mounters I work with depending on if it's a scroll or album. Sometimes what I originally planned, the idea will change depending on what the photos look like, or never know quite which photo might be the best. But always adapt the format and then decide what's the best way to present this. Can it hang on the wall? Could it gain from some calligraphy joined with it? Would it be nice as a series? And so so it's always, the process is always changing.
Wow. And so again, these pieces are inspired by traditional Chinese painting. What do Chinese artists think of an American coming and creating photographs that look like Chinese painting?
Yeah, it's funny because I have friends who don't like to travel as much, and they ask me to send them photos to see, like, oh wow, nature really does behave like that. It looks so much, well, all this elements of brushwork came from nature, so it shouldn't be surprising.
Well, that's one of the things. You look at these pictures and you see the traditional Chinese painting. You go to these places, it's like it actually looks like that. It's not like it was like very highly stylized. It was like when you look at Maohua, you showed us Maohua. I went to Maohua. And it was like, it looks like it's out of a Chinese painting. It's like, which sounds like a silly thing to say for a Chinese mountain. Of course it looks like, but you never really know until you're there, right?
The geography inspired the art. And it's also, when I was first starting out, in the early, I'd say the late 90s, early 2000s, the Chinese art scene was still very much focused on pop art, which I think people were used to in the West, and so weren't all as excited about the art that was coming out of China at that time because they had seen it before, but not so much really looking at, not really so much focused on connecting contemporary art with tradition. But then maybe around 2005 or so, people really started to see, I think, there's really wonderful contrast you can do. And now there are a lot of younger artists, photographers, painters, who are feeling they can utilize that tradition. I can understand being like, it's so bottomless that I just don't want to deal with it. I want to do something.
It also feels like from a very different reality than, like even just literally looking out the window, you see this beautiful courtyard and we're surrounded on four sides by apartment buildings. Exactly. It's kind of like, it's there, it is beautiful, but it almost feels like it's an island amongst what's going on here. But on the same time, like, this is what's always interested me about China is like, I could take this and grind it up and mix it with blueberry and call it whatever, blueberry green tea. Like, there seems no point at all in doing that.
It's like everything has been perfected
Yeah.
over so long.
Well, the thing is, like, especially when you have the tea, it's like people have been trying to make the tea as well as possible for 2,000 years.
Yeah.
Like, it just makes
Right.
no sense to say, like, oh, well, mango's in this season, I'm
Right.
gonna throw mango in there. It's like, it's not really the way that it works.
There is I think it's so funny because people won't find it surprising when thousands of people come to China for the purpose of making money. That's
Yeah.
not surprising.
Yeah.
But if you're genuinely inspired by some art form, I think, Americans may not care as much, but Chinese people, if you grow up with it, you can sometimes become a bit numb to it.
Yeah.
But when someone from outside shows appreciation, people think,
Oh, that is a good thing. I mean, that was a thing when I studied xiangsheng, like, because I originally came to study the Chinese traditional comedy, and I came on a government scholarship, and it was like, oh, the American government thinks it's worth studying xiangsheng, like this, and people really like that. They're like, yeah, I mean, it is pretty good, isn't it? Like, but they don't think about it. I remember I heard once a scholar he researched the Great Wall, and he's like, nobody in China researches the Great Wall.
Yeah.
There's like one scholar in China that researches the Great Wall, and it's like, how's that possible? It's like the biggest, like, thing, but you get numb to it. I mean, like, there were periods in Chinese history recently where they were told, like, tear down the wall and use the bricks to make your home.
Yeah.
So it's like, I think that perspective of having the foreign, there was a perspective of having the foreign mindset almost redirects the Chinese towards their own culture.
Right. And you think about a painter centuries ago, they weren't thinking we're doing Chinese art. They're like, we're doing the best art we can make.
Yeah.
And so it shouldn't be surprising for anyone to find beauty in it.
Do you feel like do you feel like there's a difference between the way that Western museums look to display or are interested in your pieces versus Chinese ones?
It almost inevitably gets grouped in with either ink art or classical art. The Asian art curators are the ones that feel the greatest
West.
connection. Right.
In the West,
right.
okay.
They feel the greatest connection to it. And so, especially when photography on its own, we usually could just put easily something in a frame. And so sometimes I work with photo exhibitions here or galleries, and I have to give them a lesson on dealing with how to handle a hand scroll and stuff, because most people
how to
don't.
display it,
Right.
how to light it.
Right. Or even just opening and closing it, and so it's good. I want people to feel inspired by it. I think in the U.S., if I give a talk about the art, people are fascinated. Oh, that's something that I never really knew about. But here, you always grow up with at least some kind of basic knowledge about certain things. And so if it inspires people to look at it more, then great.
That's great.
I think, what you were saying about the perfection over time, I remember my calligraphy teacher who, it's a little bit easier to write with a little harder brush than softer brushes are for people that have more expertise. And I remember him saying, the best hard brushes are made from these few hairs at the end of a tail of a wild weasel. And I was like, what if it's a weasel I raised myself?
Yeah, no, a Hutong weasel. It has to be a Hutong weasel. It has to be running through your air conditioning duct or whatever in order for this to work.
And so it's like everything has been tried.
Yeah, but that's the thing. It's like that's when you hear something that specific. They tried all the other animals. They tried, what if we do this? Like, is there hair on a turtle? Let's figure it out. Like little ones, I don't know. Maybe there are, but they've gone through everything once before. And so I think I always say like the way I look at the tradition is like the tradition, like. If we're just a slave to the tradition, we're not really doing anything interesting.
Right, exactly.
But the question is not whether the tradition is right or even whether the tradition is better. For me, the tradition is like, it's almost like a compass. It's like, look in that direction. There's probably something pretty good in that direction. Why is it that people use the lidded cup to make the tea when you could throw the leaves in a cup or you could even use a pot? Why does the second method exist? And, for me, this whole nature of being able to, have a whole process of being able to pour the tea be able to see the tea while it's steeping there,
Right.
be able to manipulate it to do
Yeah.
what I want to do,
Yeah.
having the moment of being able to go there and back and there
Yeah.
and back, and then being able to come out with, the end of a process to create the tea. I enjoy this a lot. So even though I like teapots and I have a couple teapots, of course,
Yeah.
I find to come back to the Gaiwan method
Yeah.
of tea making because it makes it feel like this is more than just a, we're throwing back drinks sort of thing.
Right. The great Chinese American painter Arnold Zhang was a close friend. He likes to stress that people tend to associate the word tradition with old, but it's actually the past, now, the present, and the future. This is going to be tradition now for
Yeah.
people that are yet to come.
Yeah.
And so it's keeping it going, and it always evolves, right? And
Yeah,
so
it's almost the other way of saying is tradition, or it's not tradition, but it's culture. The definition that I had heard was really good is the moment you realize you're doing it, it's not culture. So it's like we shake hands. Why do we shake hands? That's a weird thing. If you're an alien, why don't we bop heads? Why don't we touch elbows? We did that for a while. The moment you start thinking about like I'm going to be this type of handshaker, you've kind of left the culture aspect of it and you're doing something else.
Right.
And so that was the thing that I really liked what you said about the people from the past that had made this format.
Right.
They weren't thinking like, oh, this format's gonna, they're like, this is the best way I can try to express what I'm seeing.
Yeah.
With the types of textures and the materials I have available to me at the time. And so, like, do you believe if you had one of the traditional painters who made this sort of ink painting style, if they were given a camera, do you feel like they would just use the camera?
Yeah, I think it's another tool. It doesn't have to must be a brush. There were people that used all kinds of tools, whatever they could, to convey that aesthetic. And so it's, and then it's so nice because you can feel a connection, a kinship to people that is such a different reality. It's like before the U.S. existed, and so, but still feel a connection from that. So.
It's and so if you show these pieces in museums, what's kind of like the process of getting put up in, say, the Met? Like, what do they do if they want to? You get a call in the middle of the night because they don't know you're in China, and they say it's time.
No, well, it turns out in retrospect, not really knowing, I was always someone who was never shy about seeking advice, and in the beginning, I would share these experimental pieces with art history professors, with professors. When Dong, my wife, was at UCLA, we were in LA for a few years, and I shared some of the preliminary experimental albums with Li Huishu and Lothar von Falkenhausen, the two Chinese art history professors there. And they were so moved by it, and I wasn't really expecting that. I just to get some feedback, and like, oh, you got to call this person, and call this
They were
person.
like, you got it. You didn't know it, you had it, but they're like, you got it already. Like, there's something here.
And what I realized later is that when a recommendation comes from someone in academia, it's different from a gallery because you're not talking about something commercial.
Anything.
Right.
They really think it's good.
Right. And so museum curators were happy to meet. And so I just very quickly had some very positive feedback, and it took away the bad kind of pressure of having to push a lot, and it made the good pressure of just making sure I do good things, continue to do good things.
It's almost a little bit like publishing. It's like I've been trying to go through the process of selling a book that I wrote about my time studying Xiangshan.
Yeah.
And I asked the editor, I was like, what's the worst thing you can do if you're trying to really get the book done? And she said, the worst thing you can do is try to sell the book.
Right.
Like, don't write a book you think is going to sell.
Right.
Write a good book and then try to sell the book. And
exactly.
It's probably the same thing with photography. If you were like, what's in this year? Like,
Right.
People want to talk about the mechanization of the Chinese economy. And then
it's like, how can you have a long-term vision if you're thinking about, how does it rank in the auction or something like that? And so I always felt a bit, there are some artists that love it, but I was always a bit uncomfortable, like, oh, I should be pushing more. But I kind of learned that there's really nothing you can do other than just share your stuff with passion. And it's not, and you find your audience. Some people will respond, some don't, and some people may think, not say anything, but then years later they think, oh, remember
years
that?
later it comes up in their mind again, and it's
And
exactly
like,
what
it would be
we want.
perfect for this event or something.
Yeah.
And so it's in that way it makes it it's just to be released of any expectation. And that way you can. I remember also my calligraphy teacher saying, if you make this piece of art purely out of passion and joy, and compare that with thinking maybe someone will buy it, then you're not going to hold the same standard. Like, oh, this isn't quite my best, but someone may buy it or something. And so it's just a different mindset.
Yeah. And so speaking calligraphy, so you also do calligraphy. The calligraphy on the work was your own calligraphy. And you had mentioned when you were showing me the works that you had basically waited 20 years to start putting calligraphy onto the painting. So give us a real quick description in Chinese painting of how painting and calligraphy fits together in the first place, and why did you feel that you needed 20 years in order to start writing on the paintings?
There's the term that they use in Chinese visual art is the sanjue, the three perfections. And so a painting, calligraphy, and then the poem or the text, the content of the calligraphy. Ideally, not everyone did this, but some artists could write their poetry themselves, or write, and so I always respect it. At least with photography, I could reprint something, and like as a painter, you've made this beautiful painting. Now add the calligraphy. Don't mess up. You know? And
Because that's the thing. You can reprint it if you need it, but if you really made it and you mess up the calligraphy, you chop off that part of the paper. I don't know. Like, it's not going to work.
But they were so in the zone and living it that you made this amazing art.
So the goal would be you see as an ancient Chinese painter, you see the landscape, you paint the landscape, leaving a space for calligraphy, and then you might even compose a poem based off of the feeling that inspired the painting, and then use your calligraphy to be able to express the poem.
And we see like this whole expanding on the kinship idea. You say somebody that made a painting, but then the calligraphy was added hundreds of years later by someone else that either collected it or had it in their hands, or we see.
So there would be people that had a 300-year-old painting. They're like, I think I can make this better, and then they would write on it.
And these sometimes, colophons, when we see you see the story of a painting in museums, you could have a painting that's maybe like a tiny little square, but then you have 50 or 60 yards of commentary of people that were someone who maybe couldn't do calligraphy. But they had it in their hands at some point. They had their seal to it. Yeah. And the real experts will see, oh, this was in so-and-so's hands.
Yeah, so they know this was collected by whatever type of people.
But the calligraphers then added, this is how this painting made me feel. Or I saw this painting when I was together with so-and-so and so-and-so, and they asked me to write my thoughts on it.
It's almost like the comment section, but if you mess up the comment, it's 300 years or whatever painting that you're messing up the comment on.
And people say
Do you think in 300 years there'll be somebody who's like an original Facebook post from 2008? They edited it. Like they went back and edited the original Facebook post.
So forgers would, they would try to. It's so many interesting stories because there was the Qianlong Emperor put his seal on.
He was lousy about that, wasn't he?
He would
right
in the sky.
Everything.
And probably because they're always perfectly straight. It was official seal adder, probably because it was crooked.
Yeah.
And so, but it was they may have been there was a copy of a great painting, but they thought the copy was real, and so the original painting is still in great shape, but the copy has all kinds of seals and commentary on it, or something like that. So
how do you copy a painting in the old days?
Well, this was the way to learn, and it wasn't seen as a bad thing.
As like training, you would just recreate it as
right.
But you wouldn't necessarily be passing that off as a forgery. It'd just be a copy. Right. People would know it's a copy.
It all depends. There were those who, the way to learn was copy the great masters, and at some point you'll find your own voice. But if you felt you could sell, there was a great masterwork that would sell for a lot of money, then people would try to make a forgery. And if you got fooled into buying that thinking it was real, then that's your fault because I wasn't discerning enough.
Interesting.
And so there's a lot of art in Western museums which are not the original that they thought, but those copies actually are also quite valuable now because
Yeah.
the painter that made them was
It
good.
still might be 500 years old.
Exactly.
And not so much survives from that time.
Right.
So then, do you are you worried as a digital artist, like for instance, if you have a JPEG of your work, what is your relationship with that JPEG? You know?
Well, I never shy about. I post when I have new works. I post the images online. I don't mind. I'm happy. I've had people say they use it as their desktop and stuff. I'm always honored by that. But just because the actual, I want it to also be a physical object that it's a piece that you can feel the materials. It always feels a little different in person. Nice box and things like that, where it's a complete object. And so, but I know not everyone can see those,
Yeah.
so I'm happy when it gets shared.
That's good. Do you think, because this is, I have met people that, I had a conversation with with an author who wrote a great book about writing late night comedy. And I was like, would you let me translate this into Chinese and I could maybe make a class out of it? And, I'd give you a cut of the sales of the book. And the class is like, I don't want to translate it in Chinese because the moment it's translated, it's going to be pirated. And I was like, well, they could pirate it right now.
Exactly.
They don't need to wait until we do an official version of pirate it. They could be pirating
Exactly.
it now. But like there are people I think who they're worried about the work being viewed. And I think that he was really, as an artist, he's like, I don't want a bad version of my class
Right.
going around pirated.
Right.
Or it wasn't even, I don't think about the money. It was just like, I want control over how people see the art. And it sounds like you are kind of accepting, like in this age,
Yeah.
you don't have that control.
You can definitely see where, or I hope that the art inspired other artists to do something either similar or taking it a step forward. And it's an honor when that happens. But it's almost like, in a way, I feel, all right, then I better, as soon as I'm done, let me get it out there and post it so that people know I did this first.
Yeah, it's almost you. That is the other thing about like, there's a lot of talk around crypto and blah, blah, blah. But NFTs have a great future for art. Like to be able to say that when the art was created, the NFT is created and they're linked and you know that this piece is the original and you can then potentially solve disputes later on, even if they're only academic. But,
Right.
So what does it practically mean for you to day now to be an American artist in Beijing? Have there been huge changes in the way that you do your art because of how everything in China is changing? Or are you, because you're so closely tied with nature, you're, as long as you can go out and take photographs, it really doesn't matter.
I still will, I've never had problems when I'm out traveling. People are always very welcoming. Sometimes, and the subject matter, I'm trying to be as objective as possible. And I think if there's anything, it's usually, I wouldn't consider much of it very sensitive, but except maybe as environmental issues, but environmental issues are recognized as an important thing to deal with. And so depending on who you are, let's see, you see some huge industrial change, and environmentalists may feel one way about it, but local officials will feel another. Things are really humming.
Or even the locals are like, thank God they built that bridge because,
Right.
That used to take us 8 hours to get around and now we have that
exactly.
bridge.
Or like I would do research where Google Earth says, take the picture from this spot, then I get there and the mountain's gone from mining or something. It's so fast. And
So you've shown up and the mountain's gone.
And so
Do you ever feel like who at Google Earth do I sue about this plane ticket?
like between the time that the satellite image was taken and I got there, it was changed. And so that was the scale, especially the peak of like 2010 to 2015 was so fast. And but at the same time, it's this is the visual. When people see the photograph, when I show the art in China, people are very moved. I think that a Westerner is using classical formats, and this is the China that we see around us. And so, sometimes I'll get the knock late at night about having tea, quote unquote tea, but that's because they're curious. Like, why
why
would
are you
you
doing this?
possibly be here this is not a touristy area or something.
Yeah.
And if I say, like, do you realize your hometown was this theme and painting and like
1,000 years ago,
and
they're
people,
like, oh, tell me more. They're like, this sounds good.
I usually get
Yeah.
like 我们这儿没有什么好玩. Like there's
Yeah.
nothing
There's
fun
nothing
about
here. Why are you here? That's interesting. Well, it's kind of, I think that it's almost like they've decided themselves whether there is or isn't value there. And in some places they have decided there is value. Like, if you go to Chufu or like the hometown of Confucius or even, I watched actually on an airplane because I had nothing to watch. I watched a piece about somebody who went around and looked at all of the different poems by, I believe it was Dufu, and like where he had gone in his life and the scenery there. And everywhere that he had spent even a year, even a tiny island, they're like, oh, we know that Dufu was here for a year. Like, they're
and
like,
it's become Disneyfied almost.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing about it is that the, I had this moment when I was looking at one of your pieces. You have this, the Changjiang River, and there's these little boats on there, and they're not traditionally boats. They're not the traditional bamboo whatever guy with a pole. But in the wide, they kind of look like it. And then when you get in, you're like, oh, it's like a barge with like a gas engine and like some tarps. But in the wide, it kind of looks like that. And it made me realize that like when I've been to whatever Yangshuo in Guilin, and you can go down the Li River on a bamboo pole. But they're all like new. They were made for this. They aren't the real boats.
Right, exactly.
And so it's almost like, which is the real Chinese culture now? Is the barge with the tarp the real culture, or is the recreation of the bamboo the real culture? Or do we need to dig even deeper and find some old man who's still cormorant hunting with like an old barge? But like, there's only so many of those people left, and they're going to be gone in 50 years.
And I think that a lot of as people got more and more ability and resources for domestic tourism, and the scale increased, and places were designed to handle large numbers of people, it's always a difficulty between balancing, keeping it, bringing in people. And so but as a result, there's definitely a lot of scenery, photography that I was lucky to do years ago that now would have a very different aesthetic because it's been built up.
Yeah, I think that's the other thing, that search for the authenticity, it gets very confusing in some of these places. I hiked up Umeishan, Mount Ume, and I did it actually twice. The first time was in 2010, and the second time I think was in 2017. First of all, just those 7 years, complete tourism hit there. Like before, there were some tourists, and they had just built a cable car, so you could get from the parking lot to the middle to the peak. And there were people at the parking lot in the middle of the peak, but it wasn't crazy, and there was nobody hiking except for like random Israeli hikers or whatever. And then I came back in 2017. The parking lot, the middle, and the peak were flooded.
Wow.
But the other thing that I was thinking there was, even in 2010, I was like, well, is this really authentic? Because when you hike Omeishan, it's not dirt paths, it's stairs the whole way. It's stone stairs. But those stone stairs were carved there by the monks.
Exactly.
So it's like, they were like, they didn't owe our aesthetic of hiking anything. Right. They're like, we have to get a 80-foot Buddha up this mountain. I want some stairs, and so it's like, are the stairs a more authentic way of hiking a mountain, or is it a dirt path somewhere? As an American, I see stairs, I think this place is touristy. But if it was built 1,000 years ago by monks, is it?
There was this one curator who was very funny, saying, if you think about 1,000 years ago, like, who put all these pagodas up? They're totally changing the landscape, right?
Well, and it was one of the things I noticed in the piece is that there were these pylons that were clearly meant to be like parts of a bridge that was going to be put up, but it almost looked like if you were looking out over the West Lake and you see a pagoda just coming out of the water. And the interesting nature about your photography is because it has that grainy quality to it. It's almost to say, who's to say it isn't a pagoda, Or like they thought to put that there, but like the ancients thought to put a pagoda there, we thought to put a pylon there to build a bridge. And you hit it right in that moment where it was not a bridge, but also not nothing.
Exactly.
So is that the sort of thing you can tell from Google Earth when you do your research, or is that kind of a luck of the moment sort of thing?
that's what stressed the importance about being open. And sometimes why trips can either go very smoothly or just take a lot longer, waiting for the right weather or finding this particular moment. And then all of a sudden, this barge comes by or this motorcycle comes by and it makes the moment like this one very ephemeral thing in a very long history. And
so in terms of sort of a, I think one of the themes that I hear people say is that whether it's, for me, it's tea, it's comedy, it's China. How do you go about the process of taking that thing you really like and turning it into something you can actually do with your life? Has this been a proactive choice that you've made, or has it really just been like you were making photos one day and people asked for more and people asked for more, and then you realize you can kind of just do this?
Yeah, I feel it's very, very rare. I feel very blessed to be able to support ourselves doing art. And so somehow it's not very predictable, but we've been able to do it. And living in China has helped too, in that it's not only the source of the inspiration, but it's more affordable. And to be able to, that would make a choice of being here because I can survive as an artist.
Yeah.
And every once in a while, nothing will happen. We start to get nervous. Then someone will call and say, this person said I should see your art, and just share it. And somehow, over the years, we're able to get
Make
by.
it work. It's good.
And so I
And it
feel
also
very
happens.
lucky.
It also, I was saying, we were talking earlier, helps to be here early because, some of this places, beautiful view you have over here of the I guess now the Torrentang complex. But this is the sort of place that if you move to Beijing now, you just can't get.
Right.
You're not even a money thing. You just can't get them.
Who could have imagined at the time? I mean, we would have thought to spend as much on housing as possible at the time if we had known.
Yeah.
But we were very lucky. At least we knew we were here for the long haul, and we still don't have any plans to leave. It's home, and so and it's so just like the U.S. Even 20 or 30 years traveling around, I feel like I barely made a dent because it's just too big.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing is it's too big and it's too big even physically, but once you take into account history and time, I almost think that is one of the reasons, one of the things I have a pet peeve in the comedy scene right now in China. It's a little off topic, but you'll see. So I studied the traditional xiangcheng, two-person comedy. And recently, two-person comedy has come back into style in the underground clubs, but they're not doing the Chinese crosstalk. They're doing manzai, which is a Japanese version of the Chinese version. Wow. So they have chosen, rather than to take on the enormous weight of dealing with the history of xiangcheng and innovating it, to say, we're doing Japanese comedy. In Chinese, never having been to Japan, not really studying the Japanese comedy, it looks pretty damn similar. But I was talking to people backstage, and he's like, well, yeah, this is no one wants to go and do bad crosstalk and try to innovate that style. It's better to say I'm doing something completely different and avoid the sort of, the peeping, getting told off. You've taken that on in terms of you've mounted in the traditional way. Yeah. You've now written your own calligraphy on the pieces, and that's a very vulnerable thing for people that don't know, because if you make this beautiful photograph where you're really trying to make a world-class thing and your calligraphy looks like a first grader, no one's going to take your art seriously here.
Right. And in a way, when it comes to calligraphy, I'm giving a little bit more leeway because, this is a Westerner doing it. But this is why I waited so long. I don't want it to, I don't stress my identity too much.
You can't, and the same thing you're doing the traditional crosstalk, you can't allow yourself to take that easy out. Right. Because if you do, the whole thing just isn't art anymore. Right. It's some sort of is Disneyified, what it was you were saying, you can't do that. What made you finally decide that you were going to take the leap and start writing the calligraphy on the works?
It was really when we were stuck at home for COVID and couldn't. It was great for painters, not so much for landscape photographers, not being able to travel. And so I just had more time to practice. And then I know, I may have a beautiful character and then the next character will have a mistake, but I may not even be able to recognize it. And the true calligraphers, some friends of mine will always say, this could be strong or this, but otherwise I would never do it.
How do you take that note though? Because for me in comedy, Like I had to be very vulnerable and say like, I don't get why that joke is funny. Or even maybe I say something and people don't laugh, and then I have to go to my other comedian friends and say, I don't even know why they laughed.
Yeah.
But at least I heard the laughter. At least I can judge like it actually did work.
Yeah.
But with the calligraphy, I would feel like it'd be very easy to get defensive. Like, I think it looks good. And they're like, no, it's not good. I'm like, how would you possibly know?
My calligraphy teacher, when we first started years back, he would have me write something. He'd say, go home, write something. I write it a few times. And he'd say, put a little sticky note on the back of the one or the ones you think are the best. But then we'll hang them up and we'll see if we have the same opinion. And then if we didn't agree, he would say why he thought this one was the best or why. And so... and it's so you're kind of training your eye at the same time. But I remember speaking to this calligraphy presser at the Central Academy, and I said, because millions of people do calligraphy, and I said, what about the 20th century? Like, how many calligraphers from the 20th century will people be looking at textbooks? And he's like, maybe 3 or so, because to reach that level. And so you just have to
what describes that level? Like what are the, like you say, sanjue, like one of the perfections is the calligraphy technique.
Right.
What is it in calligraphy technique that makes you become one of those people that's going to be remembered?
It's like, it's the same as like what makes a great jazz musician or something. They just obviously have such control and this is a unique style, and very recognizable thing that they have created, right? And so, and you can instantly recognize this person's calligraphy, that person. And so it's just, there are many great calligraphers, but this was at a time when people were writing with a brush from when they were 3, and now you have to specifically like take your time to sit and so a lot of the great calligraphy pieces from history are letters to friends and something, because they weren't thinking about making art.
Yeah, well, it's like in jazz, the last thing you want to do is be thinking about it. You want to, it's funny you'd say that, because the technique of it is very different. Do you think that we're going to see, like, photography is still historically relatively new, but like, the youngest generation has grown up with a smartphone camera and like, f-stop control and, lots of different black and white filters. Do you feel like we're just going to see like a booming of new photography styles from all these people that have been with a phone since they were 4?
Right. And tools that we had that never, all these new tools that come available, it'll keep evolving. I don't know. There's, it's just, I have no illusions about, I do the best that I can. I'm also not a very good promoter, and so I know that from teachers using it or from people seeing in exhibitions, they see the art and they see Chiu Mai, my Chinese name, but they don't know, is that an old guy, is that a Japanese guy?
Well, that's the interesting thing is you go by your Chinese art name, so they may not know that you're American.
Right.
They know Chiu Mai, but they don't necessarily know from the work.
Right.
Have you found ever that people are surprised that you're an American guy?
This good friend, Taka, also a very accomplished photographer, he brought me, many years ago, he brought me to the home of another photographer in Shanghai at a time of a photo fair. He's like, he brought some foreigner. And then he's like, this is Chiu Mai. And they were like,
we know Chiu Mai.
They know the art. And so.
That's cool. That's the thing, I don't have that ever happen as a comedian.
Exactly.
People see it in the beginning. I get that when like cab drivers, I get into the cab and they're like, are you, 7691? I'm like, yeah, it's me. They're like, oh, wow, your Chinese is great. They call me on the phone and they're like, I'm going to be late. And I'm like, quiet, And then they're like, this angry Chinese man was actually an American. Great. That's great. So while we're on the topic of calligraphy, you had mentioned that you might be willing to show us one more piece, which is the bilingual calligraphy bit. We're going to go and take a look at that in just a moment, but for the people who are on the audio podcast, could you give us a little bit of a pre-explanation of what this piece is and how you started doing bilingual calligraphy? What even is that?
Well, what happened was right at the end of COVID, I did this very personal calligraphy piece, a scroll, where my wife and I worked together, this beautiful poem by W.S. Merwin, American poet, that I felt really described my artistic process. And certain rhythm of the poetry was very hard to translate into Chinese. A lot of these connecting words like and the and things. So I was like, let's just leave them. And it actually ended up, people really responded to this beautiful visual, like you have the characters and then these few English words thrown in there. And after COVID, the first trip back to the US, and I was meeting a lot of people that have been away from years, and especially friends from China who had gone to the US, worked very hard to study, find a career, find a path forward, and we're in a very new, challenging moment because of a lot of the unnecessary kind of tension between political tension that's occurring. And so people that feel, am I not as welcome in the West as I originally thought I would be, or there are challenges. If I come back to China, what kind of challenges will I face with my career? And so I wanted to create some art for people that refuse to take sides and like live in that in-between space. And so I just started taking these, and also makes it a little bit easier for finding my own calligraphic style. And it's still very experimental, but just there are certain visual elements that Chinese characters provide that you can't have in English. So how could you change a poem or a piece of prose by having certain keywords become a character now? And so there are a few pieces now, and people, I've been very moved because people find an emotional connection to them, especially the way the bilingual brain works. And so that it's for the people that can appreciate that, great, and people that can't, then they feel guilty or inspired to learn more or something.
Well, it's kind of, I think that especially being a bilingual person in America now, there's this effort to kind of squash that aspect of yourself in public. You speak whatever you want at home. You're not going to get, moved out of because you speak a language at home. But when you go into public and you're in an interview or you're displaying your art, unless the thing you're trying to tell people is it's bilingual, it's really hard to make bilingual works. And so that was one of the reasons I connected with it. And because it's like, if I were to express myself in the purest way that I could, I'd be throwing Chinese in there. I'd be using references people wouldn't know. And I hold that back. And seeing that calligraphy done that way made me kind of think like, oh, you don't necessarily need to hold it back. It may narrow the audience, but I am choosing to hold it back. I'm not like, there's no law that says you can, if you're doing traditional Chinese painting or whatever, you can't have English in the calligraphy. And, so it was very cool to be able to see that. So
we get very frustrated by these very strong headwinds. We work so hard for so long to make things good, and then people mess it up. And so even if it's just a little bit, I'm like, I gotta.
Well, this is the thing. Is the question is, I think that's the question for this era for people that are like, if you're not interested in conflict, what is the way forward? Because it's certainly easier in both sides to take a side. And I see it on my T channel. People are generally pretty chill on the T channel, but some people will say like, oh, I'm not going to buy anything from China or whatever. And I'm like, you're doing that to yourself, because, China's a big thing. It's been around a long time. If you can't separate the culture from the people, from the government, from all these different things, then, your opinion is not that subtle and it's not that interesting to me. But again, like there are even very well educated and very powerful people, I think, in both countries that have that sort of unsubtle thinking.
And I can say very safely to after, coming 33 years ago, and still barely feeling like I know anything. If you think you know China, you don't, because it's just. No, the one professor said, the more I learn, the more I realize, the less I know, because it's just too, and it's so rich, and so thankfully the art is evolving in that direction.
That's good. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. For people who are listening on the video, we're going to have done something to be able to show the video, and we'll go take a look at that bilingual calligraphy right now. For people listening on the audio, I really encourage you to join, especially the YouTube channel. That's where we're going to have a lot of the longer videos. Feel free to join. And for people who are watching the show and don't know, I'm Jesse, I'm your tea guy. All this tea the 2024 spring green tea. We have 4 different spring green tea options that are on the website right now. The tea sets are all on the website. This is our basic Going for Tea starter kit. If you want to get going with tea, I have everything you need to get started. It's all right there. Support the channel, have great tea, and invite great people over to talk while you do it. So thank you so much. Is there any place that people can follow you, or that you want to send people if they're watching and want to know more about your stuff?
The website is just Qiumai. The pinyin of my Chinese name is QIUMAI.net. If they want to see more images. It's always nicer to see them in person, but they could always contact me.
Nice. Very good.
Do
you have anything on display right now in the States that people might actually be able to see?
Let's see. There is. Nothing out. There's a couple of upcoming exhibitions which I'll post on the website too, if people want to see some stuff. So,
great. Awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, thanks so much, and let's go and take a look. What do you think of the tea, by the way?
It's awesome.
Good? Excellent?
Yeah, excellent.
Right. Cheers. Awesome. Thank you so much, and let's go take a look at the clicker.
Let's do it.